Hi everyone, today I'm going to take another question from a viewer. This question is from the Gokul. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So the Gokul is asking to what extent is my division of the INFJ type into 3 subtypes in my latest book, The Infinite Soul, to what extent is that, if you like, subdivision flexible? And I think what he's asking is to what extent is there movement between those particular subtypes for a person, or if you're a passive, or I should say an adaptive submissive type, are you bound to be that for life as an INFJ? If you're a solipsistic type, are you bound to be that for life? If you're a liberated spiritualized type, are you bound to be that for life? One quick mention, I want to mention 2 quick things first. First of all, please don't hesitate to ask questions. If you'd like me to cover a topic that you're interested in, I'm always hungry for new suggestions, so please don't hesitate. Do that in the comment section, or if you wish to join my Patreon page, you can suggest videos there as well, okay? I conceive of my research as bottom up. I need my research on the INFJ type and other types to be informed by interaction and testimonies of actual INFJs or people of those other types. I don't like the top-down models that are essentially kind of established from the start, from high up, and then sort of have to force everything into their categories. It tends to lead to an aridity of research in the long term, of thought. People repeat themselves, they're not very tolerant of other views, they can become a little bit cultish. That's kind of the opposite of what I want to stand for. So I always, which is why, the movement from the ecstatic soul, where I do not talk about INFJ subtype, to the infinite soul, where I do, is also illustrative of the impact that interacting with you guys has on my thinking, okay? And this is part of it. Every day, every time I read a comment, it's part of my research, okay? So now, to move to the actual question and my answer to it. Of course, the subtypes are in fact very dynamic, right? And it's just because you happen to sort of really resonate strongly, say, with the adaptive submissive subtype, which might be the case of a lot of people who are frustrated with their lives, for example, a lot of INFJs. Well, that doesn't mean that you're going to be that forever, right? Same with solipsist, and in fact same with liberated or spiritualized. These 2 words are synonyms in my book. So an important point here, and again, to the viewer who's asking the question, I think that you will understand much better what I mean here by this dynamic interpretation of those subtypes when you actually read my book, The Infinite Soul. This book here, you're probably familiar with it. I think you're going through the ecstatic soul at the moment. Thank you for getting it. If you love it, maybe you'll consider getting the sequel at a later stage. So in The Infinite Soul, there is this first chapter, which is kind of laying out the conceptual groundwork of the entire book, where I emphasize that I mean infinite in the sense of transcending these rigid categories, precisely those categories that are saying, if you're that, you cannot change. That's the problem with, say, people saying I'm an NITI INFJ, or I'm an FEST INFJ, or I'm an pure NI INFJ, or the problem is that people tend to think that if you're that, then you're that forever. And there are, there are certain things that you are for life, right? If you're an INFJ, you're not going to become some other type, for example. I'm happy to concede that. However, you can be many different kinds of INFJ throughout life, which is why I sometimes prefer talking about families and about subtypes. You can migrate between different families. And there's a dynamic patterns in terms of growth as well. A lot of INFJs, perhaps the majority of INFJs, they move from adaptive submissive to solipsist to liberated if they do get to that point. I think I said in a video that is not released yet that this scheme reminds me of something Jordan Peterson said recently. He said, a lot of people start out naive, then they move on to cynical, and then they move on to wise, ideally anyway, right? But it's a necessary stage to experience cynicism before you get to wise. You cannot really get from naive to wise. In a sense, you could argue that in my system, but I don't like calling it, I don't like calling it a system, you understand, because I don't like this essentialistic, rationalistic, and very abstract way of categorizing that does not allow this dynamism. In my framework, we'll call it a framework, you cannot really become liberated without having experienced solipsism. You cannot really move straight from adaptiveness to liberation, and that's partly because solipsism is the realization that our NI individuality, our NI world, is incredibly important to the blooming of our being as an INFJs. And often that tends to, at least in the first instance, during the first phases, it tends to come with an overvaluation of NI, which is only the logical result of a highly pronounced overcompensation for all those years where NI had been repressed effectively during the adaptive submissive phase. So there's an overcompensation that takes place in the solipsistic phase, and ideally what you want to orient yourself towards is equilibrium in the liberated phase, where you're able to, what I like to call, you're able to resolve the paradox of severance between belonging to external reality and belonging to the NI world at the same time. But even the spiritualized stage is not final. It's not finite. My research really tends to suggest that no one is liberated all the time. I don't believe in this notion that you achieve liberation and then you're liberated for the rest of your life. It's constant everyday work, and experiencing liberation. Apologies for the firefighters there, or the ambulance. Achieving liberation does not mean that you're never going to fall back into adaptiveness at times or solipsism at other times. I could make a video about more precise pathways from one particular subtype to another. It's a lot about modes of being and choices we make. We, of course, are endowed with certain temperaments, and we're born into certain family backgrounds, social networks that will, to an extent, facilitate our belonging to one or that other subtype. But it's not set in stone. And our will and the choices we make will have some bearing on whether we do progress, right? And that's why I always say that my work is a kind of Jungian existentialism. The choices we make and our exercise of will has an influence on the particular kind of color and texture of type we are, even though the overall type itself, like INFJ for some people and ISFP for others and INFP for yet others, that does not change as such. But there's lots of choices to be made within, an infinity of them, and an infinity of descriptions. Okay, so again, the book in question is The Infinite Soul, which is my new book. You can get it at the link below. I discuss these topics in more depth. It's about INFJ life in the modern world, finding purpose, meaning, and value in a world that we often see as hostile. It's about INFJs interacting with reality. And the book that our friend is currently reading is The Ecstatic Soul, which dives deep into the contents of INFJ consciousness, the INFJ mind, and its existential manifestation. It's the prequel to The Infinite Soul, and there is a clear thematic link between the two, of course. Don't forget that my Patreon page is the lifeblood of the channel. The link is below as well. From $3.50 a month, you can support me, help me keep the channel going, pursue my research, help me produce more videos where I answer your questions, where I offer new perspectives. You can interact with me there. You can, of course, suggest new content, get some bonus material too. I released some recently, but primarily you help me keep going. Okay, so consider it, and I'll talk to you next time, guys. Hope the question was answered. Bye-bye.